What got us here is the injection of a lot of debt and money. Think of it as, you've got somebody who's weak and whatever it is, and you give them this shot of buying power. And if the amount of spending increases by more than the amount of production, then prices by definition go up. And so there was a massive amount of giving away checks and money. And people seem surprised that they get inflation. Well, they're going to spend that, not going to increase very much in terms of the production. And so what is going to happen? The prices are going to go up when people spend more. And you put on top of that the issue of where we are geopolitically. It used to be primarily if some place was cheaper to produce something, then capital would go there, motivated by a profit, and it would produce it and raise living standards in those places. But it would move that production from places that would have a hollowing out, like the United States and so on, in some types of jobs. And we're now in an environment in which resources are allocated by political and ideological concerns or issues. In other words, we're not going to produce it wherever it's cheapest. And also because of worries that we might be in war, or that you could be in a war, every country wants self-sufficiency. And every country's worried, or every company is also worried, that they might be in a place where they are affected by politics. Think about it. The Nikes that you're buying, the Apples that you're buying, 22% of all manufactured goods imports come from China. And just imagine if the world said, we're against companies that are producing and operating in China, like Russia, let's say, if that was the case. That has an enormous economic effect. And companies today are considering, where do I produce it? And it's not always produce it in the most cost-effective place. That adds to inflation too. And that's our new reality. In 2008, when they had the financial system, what the Federal Reserve did is it went in and it bought bonds. And when it buys bonds, it's buying bonds from those who sell bonds. And the bonds go up, and then those who are investors then take that money and they buy other financial assets. It does not trickle down to the population. It won't get the check to the person that needs to get the check. But in this last time, what they did is the government determined who's going to get the checks. And so you're seeing both of those dynamics taking place in producing inflation. So what does that mean? There's a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift is about a 1 in 10 year shift in the perception of what's likely and what the world is. There was a paradigm that was created by a combination of low inflation and also central banks producing free money. In other words, free money like almost zero interest rate or zero interest rates. That means you never have to pay, if you borrow the money, you don't have an interest payment. And that in many cases, you had interest-only loans and you didn't even have to pay back the principal practically. And the world recalibrated to that kind of an environment, okay? A paradigm shift is when that changes. So Americans thought, and many people, there was a 40-year bull market in bonds, and they think cash is safe and bonds are safe. That's what they bought it for. What they're now realizing is that you can't judge safety in the number of dollars you have. You have to judge it in the amount of buying power you have. And so if you lose money to buying power because of inflation, you need a compensating return. So for example, with an 8% inflation and a near zero interest rate, you just lost 8% of your buying power. Then that changes behaviors. As that changes behaviors, people do not want to keep their money in there. I would not keep my money in there. As long as interest rates are low in relationship to the inflation rate and the likely inflation rate, you're going to lose buying power. So that's why you see money moving. It's better to borrow than to lend. What that does is it creates a difficulty for the Federal Reserve, because not only the amount of bonds that have to be sold are no longer the amount of the deficit. How many bonds do you have to sell? Well, it's the amount of our deficit. We have to sell bonds for that. And if there's other selling of bonds because they're not good returns, then there has to be more and more selling. And then the Federal Reserve choosing to sell, that they're going to sell $1.1 trillion of bonds. So who's going to buy all these bonds? When you look at that, that means that there's a big tightening of credit. Now, everybody says we need to fight inflation, and therefore it's good that they're catching up. They were behind it. It's almost like inflation is the only thing that people are thinking about. The way you fight inflation is taking away buying power from people. I mean, that's how you do it, right? You said, okay, now you're going to borrow less, there's going to be less liquidity and so on at the time that there's more inflation. So it's not like fighting inflation is one of those things. We fight inflation and that's a good thing and we'll get on with it. It means taking away buying power, and that causes markets to go down, and that causes economies to go down. That's why we're in a period of stagflation. Central bank is going to try to find a middle ground, but there's a lot of debt and somebody's got to be paid back, and you're either going to get paid back in real money or you're going to get paid back in deflated money. And because they want to deal with both of those things and try to have a middle course, it'll produce stagflation. So what that means for investors is, in my opinion, don't hold money in those assets that have those kind of low returns. And then many of the bubble assets, always at the end of a paradigm, people extrapolate what happened over the last 10 years and they're sure it's going to happen in the future, like tech stock. Well, okay, no. I went through this many times, the Nifty 50 or the dot-com bubble and so on. That doesn't mean that technology companies won't do well or something. It's just like dot-com companies in terms of that crash and those things. A company, when it gets very expensive, it can still provide a terrible return. Some of the best companies can provide the worst returns because they get too expensive. And so we're going through that kind of a dynamic. Which again emphasizes have a balanced portfolio with a skew toward inflation hedge assets, although there will be in the near term, over the next probably year or so, there'll be a tightening. That tightening causes the corrections and downward moves in most assets because cash becomes a problem. And so then you have that correction, and then you'll have the Federal Reserve come back in, I believe, and then print a lot of money and buy more because that's going to be the problem. So we're in that part of the cycle. You could either maintain a balanced portfolio through that, in which case, if you're having, something like the all-weather portfolio or something, or the all-seasons portfolio that you have, that's a type of time when you have the correction, but you maintain that type of balanced portfolio because you're also seeing that the inflation hedge asset part of that portfolio does very well, although it doesn't compensate for the whole, and you ride through it or you make the tactical moves that navigate it. So I would say that that's important. And I think international diversification is also important. If you have uncorrelated assets, and you easily can, because when economic conditions shift, it shifts returns from one type of asset to another kind of asset. When you have uncorrelated or low correlated assets, you can dramatically reduce your risk without reducing your return. So, just to give that as an example, the holy grail of investing, it could be 5, it could be 10, it could be 15, but you will cut your risk in half, or if you get down to 10 or 15, you will cut it by 80% without reducing your returns. It's more important to know how to diversify well than it is know how to pick the best thing. And one of the problems of the world is that everybody wants up in the stock market, they want up in the real estate market, they want up in the economy. And central banks can produce up, by giving it this shot of money and credit. They can always produce that up. But that up over a period of time has a consequence. And that consequence is that there's a lot of debt, and that has to be paid back. That will be paid back in depreciated money. To give you an idea, think about how many months or years that you could live if you didn't have an income. The more financial security you have, the more maneuverability you have, both to protect yourself on the downside and to take advantage of opportunities, and to know how to achieve a balanced portfolio. This is very important, I think, financially. And then be with people, your community. The source of happiness, psychologists have studied that above a basic level, income is not a source of happiness. Community is the highest ranked source of happiness. So how you work well with others. So I think meaningful work and meaningful relationships, to be productive and to also have the joy of those relationships, I think is of paramount importance. And then also to recognize that the world is domestically and internationally breaking into different ideologies and different economic systems, really. That happens state by state as well as around the world. And to understand which are the places that are the best for you in those set of circumstances. Then it's just the fundamentals, raise your kids well. But that's kind of it in a nutshell.